In the early years of the Cold War, Laos was supposed to be a quiet space on the map, a small kingdom of river valleys and mountains that international diplomats could label as neutral and then forget. Yet beneath that label, the country sat on a hinge of geography that mattered enormously to the surrounding wars, and in the logic of the time, geography often mattered more than sovereignty. What makes Laos unusual is not simply that it was drawn into conflict, but that so much of that conflict was designed to be deniable, conducted through unofficial channels, and publicly minimized, even as it expanded into one of the most intensive aerial campaigns of the 20th century, leaving Laos widely described as the most heavily bombed nation per capita in history. The story begins, as many Cold War stories do, with a contradiction. Laos was declared neutral in international agreements, yet it became a corridor, a buffer, and eventually a battlefield, because the forces fighting in neighbouring Vietnam treated borders as lines for diplomats, not for logistics. Even before the phrase secret war became common, American officials were already framing Laos as a strategic domino whose fall could cascade across Southeast Asia, and that fear shaped decisions that would be made quietly, incrementally, and often without the kind of open political debate that typically accompanies a declared war. After France's colonial position in Indochina collapsed in the 1950s, Laos entered independence with a government in Vientiane that was fragile, factional, and vulnerable to external pressure, and, within Laos itself, a communist-aligned movement known as the Pathet Lao gained strength, supported by North Vietnam, while royalist and right-leaning forces sought to preserve the monarchy and the central state. The result was not a clean civil war with a single front line, but a shifting contest of influence, coups, counter-coups, and armed pressure in remote provinces, all unfolding against the wider escalation of conflict in Vietnam and the growing importance of a supply network that would later be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, portions of which ran through Laotian territory. In practical terms, this meant that if North Vietnam could move men and material through Laos, then even a neutral Laos could affect the outcome of the war next door. And once that became the operating assumption, the temptation to treat Laos as a war zone without admitting it as a war zone became almost inevitable. By the end of 1959, fighting inside Laos had reached a point where the Hmong, an ethnic minority concentrated in the highlands, began to fear that their historical association with anti-communist forces would make them targets. And it was in this moment that a relationship formed that would define the hidden war. The CIA began building an irregular army through Hmong leadership, with Vang Pao emerging as the central figure, a local commander whose decisions would be shaped by the urgent need to defend communities on the ground and by the promises, constraints, and shifting priorities of distant patrons. This irregular force did not begin as a grand plan with a public timeline. It began as a practical response to a messy situation, and then grew, step by step, into a large-scale covert program. In 1961, that program was formalized in what became known as Operation Momentum, in which CIA personnel and allied trainers helped organize, train, and supply Hmong Special Guerrilla Units, a force intended to fight the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese units operating in and through Laos. On paper, Laos's neutrality was still being discussed in international forums. On the ground, the architecture of covert war was already being assembled. Small airstrips carved into mountains, supply drops into valleys, radios, and weapons moved through channels designed to avoid official fingerprints, and advisory roles framed as something other than conventional military presence. One reason this approach expanded is that it seemed to solve two problems at once. It allowed the United States to contest communist expansion without formally introducing US ground divisions into Laos, and it allowed operations to be described as support rather than war. giving political leaders space to deny escalation, even when the practical reality was escalation. Yet the secrecy had a cost. Secrecy compresses accountability, and it can also distort strategy, because if an operation must remain deniable, then it cannot always be organized in the most direct or transparent way, and the boundary between necessity and convenience becomes harder to see. The turning point, however, was not simply the creation of an irregular army. It was the moment when diplomacy appeared to impose a pause, and secrecy became even more structurally important. In July 1962, the International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos was signed in Geneva, publicly affirming that Laos would be neutral and that foreign military personnel would withdraw, a document meant to freeze the conflict and prevent Laos from becoming a wider flashpoint. Officially, this was the end of foreign involvement. In practice, it functioned more like a mask placed over a war that did not truly stop. The logic was simple and grim. When a neutral country is used as a supply corridor by one side, and when the other side sees that corridor as decisive, the diplomatic label does not erase the incentives that created the conflict, and so the war can continue under the surface, even if official statements insist it has been contained. Declassified historical documentation from U.S. government records later reflects how American policymakers understood the Geneva framework as a means rather than an end, and how they considered alternative measures when they believed the accords were being violated. This is where the narrative begins to take on its distinctive character, a war waged through unofficial channels, described in limited language, governed by restrictions that existed as much for political optics as for military logic, and sustained by the belief that what could not be publicly acknowledged could still be operationally pursued. Over time, that belief would lead to a widening air war, and eventually to named covert air campaigns such as Barrel Roll in the north, coordinated with Laotian leadership, while still treated as sensitive and restricted within American policy circles. But before the bombing reaches its peak, before the Plain of Jars becomes a stage for repeated offensives and counteroffensives, and before the countryside is permanently changed by unexploded ordnance, there is an earlier, quieter phase that matters just as much. The phase in which Laos becomes a place where war is conducted as a method, not announced as an event, and in which the first decisions, training an irregular army, building covert logistics, sustaining deniability under a neutrality agreement, create a momentum that becomes difficult to reverse. As the neutrality agreement settled into place on paper, the war inside Laos entered a phase that was paradoxically both more constrained and more dangerous, because the rules governing it were now shaped not only by military necessity, but by the constant need to preserve plausible deniability, and this meant that actions were increasingly filtered through secrecy rather than openly debated strategy. Although foreign troops were officially withdrawn in 1962, North Vietnamese forces did not meaningfully leave Laos. Instead, they dispersed, concealed themselves within Pathet Lao zones, and continued expanding the logistical network that fed the war in South Vietnam, while the Pathet Lao consolidated control over large swaths of the countryside. For American planners, this created an uncomfortable dilemma. To do nothing would allow the Ho Chi Minh Trail to operate unchallenged, yet to act openly would collapse the fiction of Laotian neutrality and risk diplomatic fallout with the Soviet Union and China. The solution was escalation without acknowledgement, a gradual expansion of air operations framed as defensive support rather than combat, and by 1964, this approach crystallized into sustained bombing campaigns that would eventually dwarf earlier covert actions in scale and intensity. Under the codename Barrel Roll, American aircraft began striking Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese positions in northern Laos, while in the southern Panhandle, operations later known as Steel Tiger and Tiger Hound targeted supply routes feeding the war in Vietnam, all while public statements carefully avoided describing these missions as part of an active war in Laos. Pilots flew under restrictive rules of engagement, missions were classified at high levels, and records were often compartmentalized so that no single civilian authority could easily grasp the full scope of what was happening, creating a system in which the war expanded through institutional momentum rather than explicit political decisions. Meanwhile, on the ground, the CIA's reliance on the Hmong intensified, and what had begun as a guerrilla force designed to harass enemy units evolved into a standing, irregular army tasked with holding territory, defending key areas like the Plain of Jars, and absorbing the brunt of ground combat that the United States was unwilling to fight directly. This placed an enormous burden on Hmong communities, whose villages became both recruitment pools and targets, and whose survival increasingly depended on American air resupply, tying their fate ever more tightly to a war they did not start and could not control. As the bombing increased, so did displacement, with tens of thousands of civilians fleeing contested regions, often moving multiple times as front lines shifted unpredictably, and by the late 1960s, entire areas of Laos were defined less by governance than by flight schedules, with daily routines structured around the sound of approaching aircraft and the hope that bombs would fall elsewhere. The secrecy surrounding the war also meant that mistakes were harder to correct because civilian casualties, misidentified targets, and long-term consequences rarely entered public debate at the time they occurred, allowing operational habits to persist even as their humanitarian cost mounted. By 1968, the scale of bombing in Laos had reached extraordinary levels, with millions of tons of ordnance dropped over the course of the conflict, much of it in the form of cluster munitions that scattered unexploded bomblets across farmland, forests, and villages, creating dangers that would remain lethal decades after the war ended. Strategically, the results were ambiguous. While bombing disrupted supply routes and inflicted heavy losses, it did not break North Vietnam's ability to move men and materiel, nor did it decisively defeat the Pathet Lao, who adapted to air power by dispersing, hiding, and rebuilding. Politically, however, the consequences were clearer. Laos had become fully entangled in the Vietnam War without ever being publicly recognized as such, and its internal conflict was now inseparable from the outcome of the wider regional struggle. As the United States escalated in Vietnam and then began searching for ways to disengage, Laos increasingly became a holding ground, a place where bombing could continue even as troop withdrawals were discussed elsewhere, and this asymmetry prolonged the violence long after any realistic prospect of victory had faded. Within Laos, the war's rhythms hardened into a grim routine, seasonal offensives followed by temporary lulls, villages destroyed and partially rebuilt, young men lost faster than they could be replaced, and a population growing accustomed to danger as a permanent condition rather than an interruption. By the early 1970s, the secret war was no longer truly secret within policy circles, but it remained largely invisible to the public, overshadowed by Vietnam and sustained by the belief that ending it abruptly would unravel fragile alliances and expose years of denial. It was only when negotiations to end the Vietnam War accelerated that the logic holding the Laos conflict in place began to weaken, not because the underlying issues were resolved, but because the broader strategic framework that justified the war was itself collapsing, setting the stage for a rapid political transformation whose speed would surprise even those who had fought for years in the shadows. As negotiations in Paris edged toward an end to the Vietnam War, the conflict in Laos entered its final and most revealing phase, because once the strategic justification for secrecy began to erode, the war's underlying imbalance became impossible to conceal. By 1971, American policy in Laos had narrowed to a single overriding objective: prevent the total collapse of Allied forces long enough to secure a negotiated exit from Southeast Asia even if that meant sustaining a war that no longer promised victory. This logic was starkly illustrated during the defense of Longtieng, the clandestine headquarters of the Hmong resistance, and one of the most secret installations in the entire war. A place omitted from most maps, yet central to CIA operations in northern Laos. When North Vietnamese divisions launched a determined assault toward Longtieng in late 1971, the response was not a surge of ground troops, but an overwhelming application of air power, including B-52 strikes flown dangerously close to friendly positions, a clear signal that the war had become one of delay rather than resolution. The Hmong forces held, but at a cost that underscored the limits of the entire enterprise. Casualty rates soared, recruitment increasingly drew on younger and younger fighters, and entire communities were hollowed out to sustain frontline defense. At the same time, congressional scrutiny in the United States intensified, fueled by leaks, testimony, and a growing skepticism toward covert interventions. And while formal declarations remained elusive, the political environment that had allowed the secret war to expand quietly was rapidly deteriorating. In 1973, following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, American bombing in Laos finally ceased, not because the conflict had been resolved, but because the United States no longer had the political capital to continue it, and with that cessation, the military balance inside Laos shifted decisively. Without sustained American air support, the Royal Lao government and its allied forces were left exposed, and although a ceasefire agreement was signed within Laos itself, it functioned less as a genuine power-sharing arrangement than as a transitional pause before an inevitable outcome. Over the next 2 years, the Pathet Lao moved methodically, consolidating control, neutralizing political opponents through administrative measures rather than open combat, and capitalizing on the exhaustion and disintegration of rival factions. When Saigon fell in April 1975, the psychological impact on Laos was immediate and profound because it removed any remaining illusion that external support might return, and within months, the coalition government collapsed with scarcely a shot fired. The monarchy was abolished, the Lao People's Democratic Republic was proclaimed, and decades of covert war ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a quiet political takeover that reflected how thoroughly the conflict had been decided long before its official conclusion. Yet the end of fighting did not mark the end of consequences, because the legacy of the secret war extended far beyond regime change, embedding itself in the physical landscape, the demographic makeup of the population, and the collective memory of an entire nation. One of the most immediate outcomes was mass displacement, as those associated with the former government, the Hmong resistance, or American operations, fled across the Mekong River into Thailand, initiating a refugee crisis that would reshape communities across the world. For many Hmong families, exile was not simply a political choice, but a survival necessity, driven by fear of retribution and the knowledge that their alliance with American forces had left them permanently vulnerable. In the years that followed, hundreds of thousands of Lao refugees resettled abroad, particularly in the United States, France, and Australia, carrying with them stories of a war that few in their new countries had ever heard of, and becoming living reminders of a conflict that official histories had long minimized. Within Laos itself, the most enduring legacy was environmental and humanitarian rather than political, as unexploded ordnance left behind by years of bombing continued to kill and injure civilians decades after the last aircraft departed. Fields could not be safely farmed, children were maimed by devices dropped before they were born, and entire regions remained economically stagnant because the ground itself had become a hazard. Efforts to clear this ordnance proceeded slowly, constrained by funding, terrain, and the sheer scale of contamination, reinforcing the reality that even a war fought in secrecy leaves public, irreversible scars. Over time, historians, journalists, and survivors began piecing together the full scope of what had happened, drawing on declassified documents, oral histories, and the testimonies of those who had lived through the bombing and displacement. And as this record emerged, the secret war took on a new significance, not as an obscure footnote to Vietnam, but as a case study in the mechanics and consequences of covert warfare. It revealed how secrecy can insulate decision-makers from accountability, how incremental escalation can occur without clear endpoints, and how local populations often bear the greatest costs of strategic calculations made far away. In this sense, Laos was not an anomaly, but a precedent, an early example of how modern conflicts could be waged through proxies, classified programs, and limited disclosures, shaping outcomes while remaining largely invisible to the societies funding them. Today, as debates continue over the ethics of intervention and the use of covert force, the history of the secret war in Laos offers a sobering perspective, illustrating that wars need not be declared to be devastating, that neutrality on paper offers little protection in practice, and that the effects of hidden conflicts often endure long after the reasons for fighting have faded from view. With the passage of time, the secret war in Laos began to surface more clearly in the historical record, not because it was suddenly reinterpreted, but because the structures that had kept it obscured gradually dissolved, allowing documents, testimonies, and patterns to be seen together rather than in isolation. During the late 1970s and 1980s, congressional hearings, academic studies, and investigative journalism filled in details that had once been compartmentalized, revealing a conflict that was not improvised in chaos, but administered through a disciplined, bureaucratic system designed to function without public acknowledgement. The CIA's role, long described euphemistically as advisory, was shown to include planning, logistics, command coordination, and the maintenance of a parallel military infrastructure operating alongside the nominal Laotian state, while Air America, officially a civilian airline, functioned as a logistical backbone capable of moving troops, weapons, food, and intelligence into areas unreachable by conventional means. This system worked precisely because it existed outside traditional military command chains, enabling flexibility but also insulating decisions from scrutiny. And in Laos, that insulation allowed the war to persist even as public confidence in the Vietnam War collapsed. For many American participants, particularly pilots and intelligence officers, the war in Laos occupied an ambiguous moral space, framed as necessary, limited, and defensive, yet increasingly difficult to reconcile with the visible destruction it caused and the absence of a clear strategic endpoint. For the Lao population, however, ambiguity was a luxury they did not have, because the war's effects were direct, cumulative, and unavoidable, shaping daily life in ways that would influence generations. In villages across Xienghuang, Huafan, and the southern Panhandle, the bombing altered settlement patterns, agricultural practices, and social structures, forcing families to abandon ancestral lands and adapt to life as internal refugees long before international borders were crossed. Even after the fighting ended, these disruptions did not reverse. Instead, they solidified into new realities defined by loss, caution, and resilience. The persistence of unexploded ordnance served as a constant reminder that the war had not truly ended, only changed form, transforming combat hazards into peacetime dangers that blurred the boundary between past and present. Efforts to address this legacy, including international clearance programs and educational campaigns, unfolded slowly, hindered by limited resources and the scale of contamination. And while progress was made, the continued presence of unexploded bombs reinforced the idea that the costs of secrecy are often deferred rather than eliminated. In the international arena, the secret war gradually became part of broader discussions about the ethics of covert action, influencing debates over oversight, transparency, and the role of intelligence agencies in armed conflict. And while Laos was rarely cited alone, its experience contributed to a growing awareness that wars conducted without public accountability risk drifting beyond their original intent. This reassessment did not lead to consensus, but it did alter how similar operations were discussed in subsequent decades, introducing cautionary references to Southeast Asia whenever secrecy and intervention intersected. Within the Lao diaspora, memory played a different role, serving not as an abstract lesson, but as a lived inheritance passed from one generation to the next, shaping identity, community, and political advocacy. Hmong veterans and Lao refugees worked to preserve their histories through oral storytelling, cultural events, and memorial efforts, not to relive the war, but to ensure that it was acknowledged as real, consequential, and human, rather than as a marginal subplot in someone else's narrative. This push for recognition eventually found limited institutional expression, with symbolic gestures, memorials, and statements that acknowledged the existence of the secret war and the contributions of those who fought within it, even if full reconciliation remained elusive. In Laos itself, the official narrative continued to emphasize revolutionary victory and national unity, often downplaying the complexity of the conflict and the extent of foreign involvement, a choice that reflected both political necessity and the challenges of governing a country still marked by division and dependency. Yet beneath this narrative, the lived memory of the war persisted in quieter forms, in the caution of farmers, the stories of elders, and the geography of a landscape shaped by violence and recovery. Over time, the secret war has come to be understood not simply as a hidden chapter of the Cold War, but as an example of how modern conflicts can unfold in layers, with official narratives masking parallel realities, and how those realities eventually surface through their consequences rather than their documentation. Laos's experience demonstrates that secrecy can delay recognition, but it cannot prevent impact, and that the absence of public debate during a war does not spare societies from reckoning afterward. As historians continue to reassess Cold War interventions, Laos stands as a reminder that wars need not be large in troop numbers or loud in rhetoric to be transformative, and that some of the most consequential conflicts are those that unfold quietly, sustained by denial, and remembered only once their effects can no longer be ignored. As the secret war receded further into the past, its meaning shifted from an active political liability into a subject of historical interpretation. And it is in this phase that the war's significance becomes clearer, not as a failed or successful campaign, but as a case study in how modern states manage violence beyond public view. What distinguishes Laos is not simply the intensity of the bombing or the scale of displacement, but the administrative normalcy with which the conflict was conducted, because once secrecy became institutionalized, it transformed extraordinary actions into routine procedures. Flight schedules were drawn up, supply quotas calculated, casualty figures recorded and filed, all within systems designed to obscure rather than illuminate their purpose. And this bureaucratic calm allowed the war to continue without triggering the moral urgency that visible wars often provoke. Over time, this normalization of secrecy altered the relationship between policymakers and consequences, because when outcomes are hidden, feedback loops weaken and decisions can persist long after their strategic value has diminished. In Laos, this dynamic contributed to a situation in which bombing campaigns intensified, even as evidence mounted that they could not achieve decisive results, reinforcing a pattern of action driven more by inertia than by reassessment. For the people living beneath those campaigns, however, there was no abstraction, only repetition, as seasons were measured not by harvest cycles alone, but by the arrival of aircraft and the rhythms of evacuation and return. Children grew up with a heightened awareness of sound, distinguishing between distant and immediate danger, while elders learned to read subtle signs in the environment that might signal incoming attacks, a collective adaptation to a reality imposed from above. When the war ended, these adaptations did not vanish. They became part of a shared psychological landscape that shaped how communities responded to risk, authority, and uncertainty. In this sense, the secret war altered not only the physical terrain of Laos, but also its social fabric, embedding caution and resilience into daily life in ways that are difficult to quantify but deeply felt. Internationally, the war's gradual exposure contributed to a re-evaluation of covert operations during the Cold War, particularly as similar patterns emerged elsewhere, prompting scholars and legislators to ask whether secrecy itself had become a strategic substitute for accountability. While no single conflict ended covert warfare as a practice, Laos provided a concrete example of how secrecy can expand the scope of intervention while narrowing the space for democratic oversight, a lesson that resonated in later debates over intelligence activities in Latin America, the Middle East, and beyond. For the United States, the secret war became part of a broader reckoning with the Vietnam era, complicating narratives of intent and outcome by highlighting how parallel conflicts unfolded outside public awareness, and challenging assumptions about the limits of executive power in foreign policy. For Laos, the reckoning was more immediate and personal, as the country faced the task of rebuilding with limited resources, constrained political freedom, and a population shaped by years of disruption. Reconstruction proceeded unevenly, hampered by unexploded ordnance, economic isolation, and the loss of skilled labour to exile. Yet communities adapted, drawing on traditions of mutual support and gradual recovery. Over time, Laos reopened to the world, cautiously engaging with regional partners and international organisations, even as the political structure established after 1975 remained firmly in place. Visitors to Laos today may encounter a country that appears tranquil, even timeless. Yet beneath that surface lies a history that challenges simplistic understandings of peace and war, reminding observers that silence does not equal absence, and neutrality does not guarantee protection. The secret war in Laos ultimately stands as a reminder that modern warfare is not always announced with declarations or concluded with parades, and that some of its most enduring consequences emerge long after the last weapons fall silent. It illustrates how conflicts fought in the shadows can shape nations just as profoundly as those fought in the open, and how the absence of immediate recognition does not diminish responsibility or impact. In reflecting on Laos, the question is not only how such a war could be hidden, but what it reveals about the systems that made it possible, and whether those systems have truly been dismantled or merely refined. As long as states possess the capacity to wage war without acknowledgement, the lessons of Laos remain relevant, urging caution, transparency, and an awareness that even the quietest wars leave loud echoes in the lives of those who endure them. In the years since the secret war faded from active memory, its story has taken on a broader resonance that extends beyond Laos itself, because it forces a reconsideration of how history is recorded and whose experiences are granted visibility. Wars that are openly declared tend to leave dense paper trails, public debates, and widely shared narratives, while wars conducted in secrecy rely on fragments, partial disclosures, and the memories of those who lived through them, and this imbalance shapes how future generations understand cause and consequence. In Laos, the absence of sustained public acknowledgement during the war years meant that suffering unfolded without the validating effect of recognition, leaving many survivors with a sense that their experiences existed outside official history. This gap has gradually narrowed as scholars, activists, and members of the Lao and Hmong diaspora have worked to document what happened, yet the process itself underscores how much effort is required to reconstruct events that were never meant to be fully seen. Declassified documents reveal patterns, but they rarely capture the texture of daily life under bombardment, the choices families made to survive, or the quiet calculations of risk that defined existence in contested zones. And it is in these lived details that the true cost of the war resides. The secret war also complicates traditional distinctions between civilian and combatant, because entire communities were drawn into the logic of warfare, whether through forced relocation, reliance on airdrop supplies, or the constant threat posed by unexploded ordnance, blurring boundaries that legal frameworks often assume to be clear. This blurring persists long after the fighting ends, as children born decades later inherit landscapes and social conditions shaped by decisions made before they were alive. In this way, the secret war challenges linear narratives of conflict, suggesting instead that wars have long tails, with consequences unfolding across generations rather than concluding neatly with ceasefires or regime changes. For Laos, this long tail has included not only physical hazards and demographic shifts, but also a complicated relationship with memory, where official silence and private remembrance coexist uneasily. In international discourse, Laos is often referenced briefly, if at all, in discussions of the Vietnam War. Yet its experience offers insights that are distinct and instructive, highlighting how smaller states can be subsumed into larger strategic struggles without their consent, and how neutrality can be overridden by geography and power. The secret war reveals that the absence of formal declarations does not prevent escalation, and that secrecy can serve as both shield and accelerant, protecting decision makers while enabling actions that might otherwise provoke resistance. As contemporary conflicts increasingly involve cyber operations, proxy forces, and deniable interventions, the lessons of Laos gain renewed relevance, reminding observers that invisibility does not equate to insignificance, and that the most consequential impacts of conflict may occur far from the public eye. For those who study war not only as a series of battles, but as a social phenomenon, Laos stands as a case where strategy, secrecy, and human endurance intersected in ways that continue to reverberate. The war that was hidden ultimately reshaped a nation, scattered its people across continents, and altered the landscape in ways that persist to this day, offering a sobering example of how power operates when unobserved, and how history must often be recovered rather than simply read. As the secret war receded into archival silence, its most enduring significance began to emerge not through military assessments or strategic summaries, but through the slow accumulation of consequences that could not be erased or classified away, revealing how a conflict fought without declaration can nonetheless shape a nation as profoundly as any open war. One of the clearest expressions of this legacy is found in the physical landscape of Laos itself, where the terrain still bears the imprint of a campaign that prioritized disruption over occupation and air power over governance, leaving behind a geography altered by craters, defoliation, and unexploded munitions. In many rural provinces, especially those along the former bombing corridors, land use remains constrained by danger, with farmers forced to navigate fields that may still contain remnants of ordnance dropped decades earlier, turning routine agricultural labour into an exercise in risk assessment. This persistent hazard has influenced patterns of settlement and development, slowing economic growth and reinforcing cycles of poverty that cannot be understood without reference to the war's hidden intensity. At the same time, the presence of unexploded ordnance has shaped social memory, embedding the conflict into everyday life through warning signs, school lessons, and community rituals that acknowledge danger as a constant companion rather than a distant past. Beyond the physical, The war's legacy is also visible in demographic shifts that reshaped Laos and its diaspora, as displacement during and after the conflict permanently altered the composition of communities, both within the country and abroad. The mass exodus of refugees did more than relocate individuals. It fragmented families, disrupted cultural transmission, and created transnational networks defined by shared loss and adaptation. For many in the Lao and Hmong diaspora, identity became inseparable from the experience of exile, with memories of war functioning as both a source of trauma and a foundation for collective resilience. These communities carried their histories into new political contexts, where they often encountered ignorance or disbelief regarding a war that had been invisible to the societies receiving them, prompting advocacy efforts aimed not only at material support, but at recognition itself. This struggle for acknowledgement reflects a deeper truth about the secret war, that invisibility during conflict often produces invisibility afterward, requiring sustained effort to insert suppressed experiences into public consciousness. In academic and policy circles, the gradual revelation of the secret war contributed to debates about the ethical boundaries of covert action, particularly the tension between strategic flexibility and democratic accountability. Laos demonstrated how secrecy can allow operations to expand incrementally, shielded from scrutiny until their cumulative effects become undeniable, and how this process can distance decision-makers from the human consequences of their choices. The war also exposed the limitations of proxy warfare, showing that reliance on local forces, while reducing direct exposure for external powers, can impose disproportionate burdens on those forces and their communities, especially when strategic priorities shift or support is withdrawn. For the Hmong, this dynamic was especially stark, as their alliance with American intelligence agencies brought short-term protection and long-term vulnerability, culminating in abandonment when geopolitical calculations changed. This pattern resonates beyond Laos, echoing in later conflicts where local partners bore the risks of collaboration without guarantees of enduring support. Politically, the secret war underscores how outcomes can be determined less by battlefield victories than by shifts in external commitment, illustrating that the withdrawal of support can be as decisive as defeat, and that wars sustained by secrecy are often ended not by resolution but by exhaustion or irrelevance. In Laos, the Pathet Lao's eventual victory was facilitated not only by military persistence, but by the evaporation of opposing alliances once the broader Cold War context evolved, reinforcing the notion that small states caught between great powers are often subject to forces beyond their control. The post-war government's emphasis on unity and revolutionary legitimacy reflects an attempt to stabilize a society fractured by years of hidden violence, yet this narrative simplification also highlights the challenges of reconciling divergent memories within a single national story. For survivors whose experiences did not align neatly with official accounts, remembrance became a private act, sustained through family stories, rituals, and diasporic networks, rather than state commemoration. Over time, international efforts to address the war's aftermath, including ordnance clearance and historical acknowledgement, have offered partial redress, but they also reveal the asymmetry between the ease of waging war covertly and the difficulty of repairing its damage. Clearing bombs takes decades, rebuilding trust takes generations, and reconstructing history requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The secret war in Laos thus challenges simplistic distinctions between war and peace, showing that the end of active fighting does not mark the end of conflict's influence, and that the most profound effects of war often unfold quietly, long after headlines have moved on. In reflecting on this history, Laos becomes more than a case study. it becomes a lens through which to examine the broader dynamics of power, secrecy, and responsibility in the modern world. The war's invisibility did not make it smaller, kinder, or less consequential. It merely delayed recognition, allowing its impacts to seep into the foundations of society rather than erupting in a single moment of reckoning. As contemporary conflicts increasingly rely on deniable actions, remote technologies, and proxy relationships, the lessons of Laos remain urgent, reminding us that wars fought in the shadows still cast long shadows of their own, and that the true measure of a conflict is not how quietly it is conducted, but how deeply it alters the lives of those who endure it. As the story of the secret war continues to be examined, its relevance extends into how modern societies choose to remember, forget, or reinterpret conflict, because Laos illustrates that historical silence is rarely accidental and often reflects deliberate structures of power and narrative control. The absence of widespread public awareness during the war years meant that there was no shared moment of national reckoning, no collective pause to assess costs while events were unfolding, and this lack of contemporaneous reflection allowed the conflict to proceed according to internal logics rather than public consent. When the war finally ended, it did so quietly, without ceremonies or widespread acknowledgement, reinforcing a pattern in which the conclusion of violence did not coincide with closure or understanding. This delayed awareness had profound implications for accountability, as decisions made under secrecy were insulated from challenge at the moment they mattered most, leaving later generations to piece together responsibility through documents and testimony rather than debate. In Laos, this translated into a post-war environment where questions of blame, justification, and redress were never openly resolved, instead giving way to a political settlement that prioritized stability over truth, a choice that may have prevented renewed conflict but also left deep wounds unaddressed. The long-term psychological effects of this unresolved history are evident in the ways communities process trauma, often emphasizing endurance and adaptability rather than confrontation, a cultural response shaped by necessity rather than preference. For many survivors, especially in rural areas, survival itself became the measure of success, and memory was preserved quietly within families and villages, rather than through formal mechanisms of commemoration. In the diaspora, memory took on a different form, becoming a tool for identity formation and political advocacy. As refugees sought recognition for experiences that had been marginalized in both their homeland and their host countries, these parallel modes of remembrance underscore how war's legacy is not singular but plural, shaped by geography, power, and access to narrative platforms. The Secret War also invites reflection on the language used to describe conflict, particularly the euphemisms that can obscure reality, such as support, assistance, or operations, terms that sanitize violence and distance audiences from its consequences. In Laos, such language played a critical role in maintaining the war's invisibility, allowing actions that would have been politically contentious under the label of war to proceed under less scrutinized categories. This linguistic framing did not merely reflect secrecy, it produced it, shaping how information flowed and how decisions were justified. The persistence of these patterns in later conflicts suggests that Laos was not an anomaly, but an early example of a broader shift toward less transparent forms of warfare, where the boundary between peace and conflict becomes increasingly blurred. The reliance on air power, remote operations, and proxy forces seen in Laos prefigured later strategies that emphasized technological reach over territorial control, raising questions about how accountability can be maintained when the instruments of war are geographically and politically distant from those who authorize them. For Laos, the consequences of this approach were profound, as the war transformed not only its physical environment, but its political trajectory, embedding the country within a regional order shaped by Cold War outcomes rather than domestic consensus. The establishment of a one-party socialist state after 1975 reflected both the victory of the Pathet Lao and the exhaustion of alternatives, a political consolidation that closed off certain paths while opening others, and whose legitimacy rested in part on the narrative of resistance against foreign intervention. Yet this narrative coexists uneasily with the lived experiences of those who fought on different sides, or who suffered regardless of allegiance, highlighting the tension between national stories and personal histories. Over time, incremental openness within Laos and increased engagement with the international community have allowed more nuanced discussions of the war's impact, though these remain constrained by political realities. Outside Laos, the secret war has increasingly been incorporated into academic curricula, documentaries, and public discussions, not as a sensational revelation, but as a sobering reminder of the costs of invisibility in conflict. This incorporation reflects a broader trend toward examining the margins of history, recognizing that events once deemed peripheral may hold critical insights into how power operates and how societies absorb violence. In this sense, Laos offers lessons that extend beyond its borders, challenging observers to consider whose wars are seen, whose are hidden, and how that visibility shapes moral and political responses. The war's long aftermath also raises questions about responsibility across time, as contemporary generations grapple with the consequences of decisions made decades earlier, particularly in the context of unexploded ordnance and environmental damage. Addressing these legacies requires sustained commitment rather than symbolic gestures, highlighting the asymmetry between the speed of destruction and the slow pace of repair. The secret war thus stands as a testament to the enduring nature of war's imprint, even when the conflict itself was designed to leave minimal traces in public consciousness. By examining Laos, one confronts the uncomfortable reality that secrecy does not mitigate harm but redistributes it, shifting burdens away from those with decision-making power and onto those with the least capacity to influence outcomes. This recognition does not offer simple solutions, but it does demand a more critical approach to how modern conflicts are conducted and remembered, urging societies to question not only the justifications offered for war, but the mechanisms that allow war to proceed unseen. As long as such mechanisms persist, the story of Laos remains relevant, serving as both a warning and a call to attentiveness, reminding us that the absence of noise does not mean the absence of violence, and that history's quiet chapters may carry some of its most consequential truths. As the secret war in Laos continues to be revisited by historians and remembered by those who lived through it, its deepest significance lies not in any single battle or political decision, but in how it illustrates the long-term effects of power exercised without visibility, because when a war is hidden, its consequences do not disappear, they simply unfold in slower, less acknowledged ways. One of the clearest examples of this is how the conflict reshaped Laos's relationship with time itself, as entire generations experienced life not as a progression toward stability, but as a series of interruptions defined by displacement, rebuilding, and uncertainty. In rural areas, the war disrupted traditional cycles of farming, ceremony, and inheritance, replacing them with patterns dictated by survival, mobility, and caution. And even after peace was declared, these altered rhythms persisted, shaping how communities approached land, authority, and risk. Children raised during the bombing years learned to associate the sky with danger, a perception that did not vanish with adulthood. And elders carried memories that were rarely articulated publicly, but quietly influenced decisions about where to live, how to farm, and whom to trust. This intergenerational transmission of caution reflects how war embeds itself into culture, becoming a lens through which the world is interpreted rather than an isolated event to be recalled. In the diaspora, this process took a different form, as memory became both a burden and a resource, a way of making sense of displacement while forging new identities in unfamiliar societies. For many refugees, telling the story of the secret war was not initially possible, either because listeners lacked context or because revisiting trauma was too painful, and as a result, silence became a coping mechanism, delaying collective recognition even further. Only over time, as younger generations sought to understand their origins, did these stories begin to surface more openly, contributing to a gradual expansion of public awareness that contrasted sharply with the secrecy that had once defined the conflict. This delayed emergence of narrative underscores a central irony of the secret war, that while it was designed to remain invisible, it ultimately required extraordinary effort to keep its memory suppressed. And once that effort faded, the story began to assert itself through lived experience rather than official acknowledgement. The war also invites reflection on how modern states conceptualize responsibility, particularly when actions are filtered through layers of deniability that diffuse accountability across institutions and time. In Laos, decisions made in distant capitals translated into immediate dangers for villagers who had no voice in those decisions. Yet the mechanisms of secrecy made it difficult to trace direct lines of responsibility, creating a moral ambiguity that persists in retrospective analysis. This ambiguity has shaped how the war is taught and discussed, often framed as a tragic consequence of Cold War dynamics, rather than as a series of choices made by identifiable actors, a framing that risks normalizing secrecy as an inevitable feature of geopolitics rather than a contested practice. By examining Laos, however, it becomes clear that secrecy is not neutral. It actively shapes outcomes by limiting who can question, challenge, or halt the escalation of violence. The gradual escalation of bombing campaigns, the expansion of proxy forces, and the endurance of the conflict beyond its strategic usefulness all reflect how secrecy can insulate policies from recalibration, allowing them to persist through inertia rather than intention. This dynamic has implications far beyond Laos, offering insight into how contemporary conflicts may unfold under similar conditions, particularly as technological advances enable remote operations that further distance decision-makers from consequences. In this context, Laos serves as an early example of a pattern that has become increasingly common, where wars are conducted at the margins of public awareness, justified through technical language and sustained through bureaucratic momentum rather than public mandate. The humanitarian aftermath of the secret war reinforces this lesson, as the long-term costs of unexploded ordnance, environmental degradation, and displacement reveal how the effects of violence are not bounded by the duration of combat. Efforts to address these legacies require not only material resources, but political will and historical acknowledgement. Yet acknowledgement itself can be contentious when it challenges entrenched narratives or implicates powerful actors. In Laos, international assistance for ordnance clearance and development has increased over time, reflecting a partial recognition of responsibility. But these efforts coexist with ongoing debates about memory, justice, and reconciliation that remain unresolved. For the Lao state, managing this legacy involves balancing the desire for national unity with the realities of a diverse population whose experiences of the war were far from uniform, and whose memories do not always align with official histories. For the diaspora, the legacy involves navigating the tension between integration into new societies and the preservation of a past that shaped their families' trajectories, a process that continues to evolve as younger generations reinterpret what the secret war means for their own identities. Taken together, these dynamics highlight that the true impact of the secret war cannot be measured solely in tonnage dropped or territory controlled, but in the ways it reconfigured lives, relationships, and perceptions across time and space. The war's invisibility did not lessen its force. It merely displaced recognition, allowing consequences to accumulate quietly until they became part of the fabric of everyday life. In this sense, the secret war challenges conventional metrics of historical significance, suggesting that some of the most transformative conflicts are those that operate beneath the surface, shaping societies without ever fully entering public consciousness. By continuing to examine Laos, scholars and observers are not simply uncovering a hidden chapter of the Cold War. They are engaging with fundamental questions about how power is exercised, how violence is normalized, and how history is constructed in the absence of transparency. These questions remain urgent, as the conditions that enabled the secret war have not disappeared, and the temptation to conduct conflict quietly persists wherever visibility is perceived as a constraint. The story of Laos thus endures not only as a record of what happened, but as a reminder of what can happen when wars are allowed to proceed unseen, and why vigilance, memory, and openness are essential to preventing history's quietest tragedies from repeating themselves. As the secret war in Laos is examined from the distance of decades, its final and perhaps most important lesson emerges not from the decisions of governments or the movements of armies, but from the way ordinary people were forced to adapt to a reality imposed without warning, consent, or explanation. Because when a war is hidden, civilians are denied even the basic psychological framework that allows suffering to be understood as part of a recognized crisis. In Laos, there were no formal declarations that signaled a beginning, no clear announcements that marked escalation, and no widely acknowledged end that allowed communities to collectively process what had happened. And this absence shaped how trauma settled into society, not as a discrete memory, but as a continuous condition. Villagers did not experience the war as a chapter with boundaries. They experienced it as an unpredictable environment in which safety could not be assumed and danger could arrive without context, making caution a permanent state rather than a temporary response. This had profound implications for how trust functioned, as people learned to rely on close kin and immediate networks rather than institutions that appeared distant, opaque, or complicit in forces beyond local control. Over time, this eroded confidence in external authority and reinforced a culture of quiet endurance, where survival depended less on appealing for protection and more on adapting silently to circumstances that could not be influenced. Even after the bombing stopped, these adaptations did not simply disappear, because habits formed under threat tend to persist when uncertainty remains, and in post-war, Laos uncertainty was everywhere, embedded in unexploded ordnance, political surveillance, and economic scarcity. The result was a society that outwardly stabilized while inwardly carrying unresolved tension, a condition that shaped how people spoke, remembered, and passed on knowledge to younger generations. Children born after the war inherited not only contaminated land, but inherited behaviors, warnings, and silences, learning where not to dig, which paths to avoid, and which topics to discuss only within trusted circles, absorbing the war indirectly through caution rather than narrative. This mode of transmission meant that the war's memory was diffuse rather than centralized, spread across countless individual experiences rather than crystallized in a single national story, making it resilient but also fragmented. In the diaspora, a parallel process unfolded as families who fled Laos carried these patterns into new environments, where safety was materially greater, but psychological habits persisted, shaping how parents raised children, how elders interpreted authority, and how communities organized themselves. In many cases, the absence of recognition in host countries reinforced the original invisibility of the war, forcing refugees to explain not only their trauma, but the existence of the conflict itself, a burden that often discouraged disclosure and delayed healing. Over time, however, the children of refugees began asking questions, driven by a desire to understand their origins and reconcile inherited caution with the freedoms of their new societies. And this generational shift played a crucial role in bringing the secret war into broader awareness. Through education, activism, art, and scholarship, these younger voices translated private memory into public narrative, not to sensationalize the past, but to assert its legitimacy as history. This process revealed how secrecy does not eliminate accountability, but postpones it, transferring the work of reckoning onto those least responsible for the original decisions. In Laos, the gradual acknowledgement of the war's impact has intersected with efforts to address its material legacies, particularly unexploded ordnance. Yet even here, the imbalance is striking, as the scale of harm far exceeds the resources devoted to remediation, underscoring how easily destruction can outpace repair. Clearance teams move methodically through fields and forests, removing bombs one by one, while development projects cautiously follow, illustrating that peace, when delayed and partial, becomes a slow and uneven process rather than a definitive transition. This reality challenges common assumptions about post-war recovery, suggesting that when wars are fought without public oversight, their aftermaths are likewise under-supported, lacking the political urgency that accompanies recognized disasters. Internationally, the secret war has influenced how scholars and policymakers think about covert action, yet its lessons are often absorbed selectively, cited as cautionary examples, without fully confronting the systemic incentives that produce similar outcomes elsewhere. The persistence of proxy warfare, deniable interventions, and remote strikes indicates that the conditions that enabled the secret war have not disappeared, even if their forms have evolved. Laos thus serves as a reminder that history does not merely record what happened. It reveals patterns of behavior that repeat when circumstances allow, and that without sustained attention, the same mechanisms can generate new hidden conflicts under different names. For those who lived through the war, however, the relevance of these lessons is not theoretical, because their lives remain shaped by decisions made under secrecy, decisions whose consequences continue to unfold long after strategic objectives have faded from memory. In reflecting on Laos, the essential question is not only how such a war could occur, but why it was allowed to remain unseen for so long, and what that invisibility permitted in terms of escalation, duration, and disregard for civilian cost. The answer lies partly in geopolitical rivalry, partly in bureaucratic momentum, and partly in the assumption that distance and secrecy diminish responsibility, an assumption that Laos decisively disproves. The secret war demonstrates that when violence is hidden, it does not become smaller or more humane. It becomes harder to challenge, easier to prolong, and more deeply embedded in the lives of those who have no power to stop it. As long as modern states retain the ability to wage war without acknowledgement, the story of Laos remains unfinished, not as a closed chapter of Cold War history, but as an ongoing warning about the dangers of silence, the fragility of neutrality, and the human cost of conflicts conducted beyond the reach of public conscience. As the legacy of the secret war in Laos continues to unfold across generations, its most enduring influence may be found not in policy archives or diplomatic histories, but in the quiet ways it reshaped how people understand security, belonging, and the meaning of peace. Because when a society experiences prolonged violence without recognition, the concept of peace itself becomes conditional rather than absolute. In Laos, peace after 1975 did not arrive as a clean rupture from the past, but as a gradual reduction in visible violence layered over unresolved fear, loss, and constraint, creating a reality in which stability was real but fragile, and freedom was defined more by the absence of bombing than by the presence of choice. This distinction mattered deeply for those who had lived through years when survival depended on invisibility, because habits formed under secrecy do not dissolve simply because the external conditions change. Many Laotians learned to speak carefully, to avoid drawing attention, and to accept uncertainty as a permanent feature of life, traits that served them well during war but became embedded social norms afterward. These norms shaped how communities interacted with the post-war state, often favoring compliance and caution over confrontation, not because people lacked opinions or grievances, but because history had taught them that visibility could be dangerous. In this way, the secret war influenced not only the outcome of political power, but the texture of civic life itself, contributing to a culture in which silence was often equated with safety and endurance with virtue. For the Hmong, whose wartime alliance with American forces made them uniquely vulnerable, the transition to peace was especially complex, as victory for the Pathet Lao translated into displacement, marginalization, or exile rather than reconciliation. Those who remained in Laos faced suspicion and periodic repression, while those who fled carried the burden of abrupt cultural dislocation, moving from subsistence economies and tight-knit clans into urbanized, bureaucratic societies, where their skills and histories were often misunderstood or undervalued. In these new contexts, the memory of the secret war functioned both as a source of pain and as a foundation for solidarity, shaping community institutions, religious practices, and intergenerational expectations. Elders emphasized resilience and adaptability, passing on stories not as linear histories, but as lessons embedded in proverbs, rituals, and warnings, while younger generations negotiated how to honor these inheritances without being constrained by them. This negotiation has been particularly visible in the arts, scholarship, and activism of second and third generation Lao and Hmong individuals, who have sought to translate private memory into public discourse, reframing the secret war as a shared historical responsibility rather than an obscure anomaly. Their efforts have contributed to a gradual shift in how the war is understood internationally, moving it from the margins of Vietnam War narratives into a distinct subject of study that challenges conventional assumptions about neutrality, sovereignty, and intervention. Yet this shift has been uneven, reflecting broader patterns in how global attention is distributed, with conflicts involving powerful nations or dramatic visuals often eclipsing those that unfold quietly or affect smaller populations. The secret war thus exposes an uncomfortable truth about historical memory, that visibility is not proportional to suffering, and that recognition often follows power rather than need. This imbalance has practical consequences, influencing which legacies are addressed, which victims are acknowledged, and which responsibilities are assumed. In Laos, the slow pace of unexploded ordnance clearance exemplifies this disparity, as the labour-intensive work of removing bombs dropped decades ago competes with contemporary crises for funding and attention, leaving communities to live with danger as a normalised condition. Each cleared field represents progress, yet also highlights how much remains undone, reinforcing the sense that the war's end was administrative rather than restorative. This gap between cessation and repair underscores the asymmetry inherent in covert warfare, where the costs of action are immediate and concentrated, while the costs of accountability are diffuse and delayed. For policymakers, the secret war offers a cautionary lesson about the long-term implications of strategies that prioritize deniability over sustainability, revealing how short-term political convenience can generate enduring humanitarian and moral obligations. For scholars, it provides a framework for examining how secrecy shapes not only decision-making, but historical interpretation, complicating efforts to assign responsibility or evaluate outcomes when documentation is incomplete or deliberately obscured. For affected communities, it remains a lived reality, influencing identity, opportunity, and the transmission of memory across generations. These multiple perspectives converge on a single insight: that wars fought in secrecy do not end quietly, even if they begin that way. Their consequences accumulate, resurfacing in unexpected places and times, shaping lives far removed from the original battlefields. In Laos, this accumulation is visible in the continued presence of refugees abroad, the cautious rhythms of rural life at home, and the persistent effort to tell a story that was never meant to be told. The secret war's enduring relevance lies in its capacity to illuminate how power operates when unobserved, how violence becomes normalized through repetition and distance, and how communities adapt in ways that are both remarkable and costly. As new generations confront global conflicts that increasingly rely on remote technologies, classified programs, and proxy forces, the experience of Laos serves as a reminder that invisibility is not a moral shield, and that the absence of public scrutiny does not absolve responsibility. The war that unfolded in the shadows of Southeast Asia continues to speak, not through dramatic revelations, but through the quiet persistence of its effects, urging a reconsideration of how wars are justified, how they are remembered, and how their legacies are addressed long after the last aircraft has disappeared from the sky. As the secret war's imprint stretches further into the present, its influence can be seen in how Laos has navigated its position in the world, balancing the desire for stability with the weight of a past shaped by external forces, because the experience of being a battleground without consent left a deep imprint on how the nation approaches sovereignty, diplomacy, and risk. In the decades following 1975, Laos adopted a cautious foreign policy posture, aligning closely with Vietnam and, for a time, the Soviet Union, not merely out of ideological affinity, but out of a pragmatic recognition that isolation or overt independence had once made it vulnerable to manipulation by larger powers. This alignment brought a measure of security, but it also constrained economic development and political openness, reinforcing a model of governance that prioritized control and predictability over experimentation. As global conditions changed after the Cold War, Laos slowly opened its economy, inviting investment and tourism while retaining a tightly managed political system, a dual approach that reflects an underlying lesson drawn from its wartime experience. Visibility can invite intervention, and caution can preserve autonomy, even if at the cost of transparency. This logic, shaped by decades of disruption, continues to influence policy choices, particularly in how the state manages dissent, information flow, and international engagement. For ordinary citizens, this environment has produced a paradoxical sense of peace, one that is materially safer than the wartime years, yet circumscribed by limits on expression and opportunity, creating a quiet tension between security and freedom that echoes the earlier trade-offs imposed by the secret war. In rural regions most affected by bombing, development has proceeded unevenly, constrained by geography, lingering hazards, and limited infrastructure. Yet these communities have also demonstrated remarkable adaptability, integrating risk awareness into daily life while pursuing incremental improvements in agriculture, education, and health. This resilience is often celebrated in narratives of recovery, but it also masks the reality that adaptation was not a choice freely made, but a necessity imposed by circumstances beyond local control. The same can be said of the diaspora's success stories, which highlight perseverance and achievement while obscuring the structural forces that made exile necessary in the first place. In host countries, Lao and Hmong communities have contributed richly to cultural and civic life, yet they have also had to contend with intergenerational trauma, identity negotiation, and the challenge of preserving history in environments where it was never widely known. These communities occupy a unique position as custodians of memory, bridging the gap between lived experience and public history, and their efforts have been instrumental in pushing for recognition, whether through memorials, educational initiatives, or advocacy for continued ordnance clearance funding. Such efforts illustrate how memory work can function as a form of delayed justice, asserting that acknowledgement, even when it comes late, still matters for dignity and understanding. At the same time, the persistence of unexploded ordnance in Laos serves as a stark material reminder that some legacies cannot be resolved through narrative alone, because the physical remnants of war demand sustained practical response. Clearance operations, often supported by international partnerships, proceed painstakingly, bomb by bomb, field by field, transforming danger into possibility, yet the scale of contamination ensures that this work will continue for generations, binding the future of Laos to decisions made half a century ago. This ongoing labour highlights a broader asymmetry inherent in modern warfare, that destruction can be executed rapidly and remotely, while restoration requires prolonged, localised effort, often carried out by those least responsible for the original harm. In reflecting on the secret war, this asymmetry challenges assumptions about cost-benefit calculations in military planning, revealing how metrics that prioritise immediate strategic gains fail to account for long-term societal impact. The war also complicates narratives of agency, because while local actors made choices within constrained circumstances, those choices were shaped by an international system that treated Laos as a means rather than an end, a space through which larger struggles were fought, rather than a society with its own priorities. This instrumentalization is a recurring feature of geopolitics, yet Laos's experience underscores how profoundly it can affect the internal trajectory of a nation, altering demographics, governance, and cultural memory in ways that persist long after the original conflict has faded from view. As scholars continue to analyze the secret war, it increasingly serves as a reference point for discussions about covert operations, proxy warfare, and the ethics of deniability, not because it offers simple answers, but because it exposes the cumulative consequences of choices made in the absence of transparency. These discussions are particularly relevant in an era where technological advances have expanded the capacity for remote and classified action, raising questions about how democratic oversight can function when the instruments of war are designed to evade public scrutiny. In this sense, Laos is not merely a historical case, but a warning embedded in lived experience, reminding observers that the quietest wars often leave the deepest marks. For those who endured the secret war, its end did not bring closure so much as a new phase of adaptation, one defined by rebuilding, remembering, and negotiating a future shaped by forces they did not control. Their stories challenge us to reconsider how we define war, peace, and responsibility, urging a shift away from narrow definitions based on declarations and toward a broader understanding that recognizes harm wherever it occurs, whether acknowledged or not. As long as conflicts continue to be waged in the shadows, the lessons of Laos remain unfinished, calling attention to the moral cost of invisibility and the enduring human burden of wars that the world once chose not to see. As the secret war in Laos continues to echo across time, its final and perhaps most sobering dimension lies in how it reshaped the very concept of responsibility, not only for those who authorized and executed the conflict, but for the international community that largely failed to notice it while it was happening, because wars that remain unseen do not disappear from moral consideration, they simply redistribute accountability in ways that are harder to confront. In Laos, responsibility was diffused across institutions, administrations, and decades, creating a situation in which no single moment or actor could be easily identified as the point of failure, and this diffusion allowed the war's consequences to linger without a clear mechanism for redress. The bombing campaigns were authorized incrementally, expanded through classified channels, and justified through strategic abstractions that rarely intersected with the lived reality of those on the ground, while the absence of public scrutiny reduced the political cost of continuation, allowing momentum to replace deliberation. When the war ended, there was no equivalent incremental process for accountability. Instead, the conflict receded into the background of larger Cold War narratives, overshadowed by Vietnam and later global events, leaving Laos to manage the aftermath largely on its own. This imbalance between the ease of initiating covert violence and the difficulty of addressing its consequences highlights a structural flaw in how modern warfare is conducted, one that privileges short-term strategic flexibility over long-term human impact. For the Lao people, this meant that recovery was not framed as a moral imperative for the international system, but as a developmental challenge to be addressed gradually, if at all, reinforcing a sense that their suffering was peripheral rather than central to historical understanding. The persistence of unexploded ordnance illustrates this dynamic with particular clarity, as clearance efforts, while meaningful, have never matched the scale of destruction, leaving entire regions functionally trapped between past violence and future potential. Each cleared bomb represents a small victory, yet also serves as a reminder of the millions that remain, underscoring how the consequences of secrecy accumulate faster than solutions. This reality complicates narratives of progress, suggesting that recovery cannot be measured solely by the absence of conflict, but must also account for the enduring constraints imposed by war's remnants. The secret war also forces a reconsideration of how memory operates in societies shaped by hidden violence, because when suffering is not publicly acknowledged, it does not simply vanish. It migrates into private spaces, influencing behavior, relationships, and expectations in subtle but pervasive ways. In Laos, this is manifested in a culture that values restraint, adaptability, and caution, traits that enabled survival during wartime but also shaped post-war civic life, often limiting the expression of dissent or the articulation of grievance. These cultural adaptations are not signs of passivity, but of historical learning, reflecting an understanding that visibility can carry risk in environments where power is unevenly distributed. In the diaspora, similar patterns emerge as families balance the desire to honor their past with the need to integrate into societies where that past is not widely recognized, leading to selective storytelling and generational negotiation over what to remember and how. Over time, these negotiations have produced new forms of expression, from memoirs and academic research to community memorials and educational initiatives, each contributing to a slow expansion of public awareness that contrasts sharply with the war's original invisibility. This process demonstrates that history is not static, but contested and reconstructed, particularly when initial narratives are incomplete or suppressed. The secret war's gradual emergence into public consciousness also raises questions about whose histories are deemed worthy of attention and why, revealing how global hierarchies of power influence not only events themselves, but the way they are remembered. Laos's marginalization in Cold War historiography reflects its marginalization in the geopolitical order, a reminder that the visibility of suffering often correlates with strategic importance rather than human cost. By bringing the secret war into focus, scholars and communities challenge this hierarchy, asserting that small nations and hidden conflicts deserve the same analytical rigor and moral consideration as more prominent wars. This challenge has implications for how future conflicts are evaluated, encouraging a shift toward metrics that prioritize civilian impact, long-term consequences, and ethical accountability over short-term strategic gains. The war in Laos also complicates conventional distinctions between victory and defeat, because while the Pathet Lao achieved political control, the country emerged deeply scarred, economically constrained, and socially fragmented, raising questions about what constitutes success in a conflict shaped by external intervention. For the United States, the secret war represents neither a clear victory nor a clear defeat, but a cautionary example of how power can be exercised extensively without producing proportional benefit, undermining claims that secrecy enhances effectiveness. Instead, Laos suggests that secrecy can obscure failure as easily as it can conceal action, delaying recognition of strategic limits until costs have already been incurred. This insight remains relevant in contemporary debates over remote warfare, intelligence-led operations, and deniable interventions, where the temptation to act quietly persists alongside the risk of unintended consequences. By examining Laos, observers are invited to consider not only what was done, but how the conditions that made it possible were constructed and maintained, and whether those conditions continue to shape global conflict today. The secret war ultimately stands as a reminder that wars do not require visibility to be devastating, and that the absence of public debate during conflict does not absolve societies of responsibility afterward. Its legacy is written not only in history books, but in landscapes, communities, and lives shaped by choices made in silence, urging a broader understanding of war that accounts for both its immediate violence and its enduring aftermath. As long as the mechanisms that enabled the secret war remain available, its lessons remain urgent, challenging future generations to recognize that the quietest conflicts may demand the loudest reckoning, and that the true measure of a war is not how effectively it is hidden, but how deeply it alters the world long after it ends. As the secret war in Laos recedes ever further into the past, its final resonance lies in how it exposes the limits of forgetting, because history does not require acknowledgement to exert influence. And when events are suppressed rather than processed, their effects often become structural rather than episodic. In Laos, the war's invisibility ensured that its consequences were absorbed not through collective reckoning, but through adaptation, creating a society shaped less by resolution than by accommodation to loss, uncertainty, and constraint. This accommodation influenced how people related to authority, to land, and to one another, reinforcing survival strategies that privilege discretion over assertion and continuity over confrontation. Over time, these strategies became normalized, forming part of the social fabric rather than being recognized as responses to extraordinary circumstances, which in turn made the war's legacy harder to isolate and address. When danger becomes routine, its origins fade, and what remains is a culture oriented toward managing risk rather than challenging its sources. This dynamic helps explain why the secret war did not produce a singular moment of national trauma or reconciliation within Laos, but instead generated a dispersed and enduring imprint that continues to shape behavior long after the last bombs fell. For those who lived through the conflict, memory often exists not as a chronological account, but as a set of instincts, warnings, and silences, guiding daily decisions in ways that feel natural even when their origins are extraordinary. In this sense, the war altered perception itself, conditioning people to expect disruption and to value stability, even when it comes at the cost of openness or participation. This orientation towards stability has had mixed consequences, enabling post-war recovery in some respects, while constraining political evolution in others, reflecting the trade-offs inherent in societies that prioritize survival after prolonged crisis. In the diaspora, the persistence of these adaptations reveals how deeply they were internalized, as families carried patterns of caution, mutual reliance, and selective disclosure into new environments, shaping how they navigated education, employment, and civic engagement. While many refugees achieved remarkable success, their paths were often marked by an underlying vigilance, a readiness to adapt quickly to change, and a sensitivity to authority that reflected lessons learned under conditions of extreme uncertainty. These qualities, forged in wartime Laos, became assets in some contexts and sources of tension in others, particularly for younger generations, negotiating identities between inherited caution and contemporary expectations of expression and agency. This intergenerational negotiation underscores how the Secret War continues to unfold, not as a static historical event, but as an ongoing process of meaning-making that evolves with each retelling, reinterpretation, and challenge to silence. The gradual incorporation of the Secret War into educational curricula, documentaries, and scholarly research represents an important shift, yet it also highlights how long invisibility can persist when conflicts lack powerful advocates or dramatic narratives. Unlike wars marked by iconic images or decisive battles, the Secret War's defining features were dispersion, ambiguity, and denial, qualities that resist simplification and therefore struggle for attention in a media landscape oriented toward clarity and spectacle. This resistance to spectacle, however, is precisely what makes Laos instructive, because it reveals how modern warfare can be both pervasive and difficult to perceive, shaping lives without producing the symbols that typically anchor historical memory. As contemporary conflicts increasingly involve remote technologies, proxy forces, and classified operations, the experience of Laos offers a framework for understanding how violence can be normalized through bureaucratic routine and linguistic abstraction, distancing those who authorize action from those who endure its effects. The Secret War demonstrates that when responsibility is diffused across institutions and time, accountability becomes elusive, and moral reckoning is deferred rather than eliminated. This deferral has tangible consequences, as the slow pace of remediation in Laos shows, reinforcing the idea that secrecy shifts burdens rather than resolving them. International efforts to support unexploded ordnance, clearance and development, while valuable, remain insufficient relative to the scale of harm, reflecting a broader pattern in which post-conflict assistance is often reactive and limited, constrained by competing priorities and fading attention. This imbalance raises fundamental questions about the ethics of intervention, particularly when the costs of action are externalized onto populations with little capacity to influence decisions. In Laos, the war's hidden nature meant that these ethical questions were rarely posed at the moment they mattered most, leaving later generations to confront the consequences without having had a voice in the original debate. This temporal disconnect complicates notions of justice, as those most affected are often least positioned to demand redress, while those responsible may no longer be in power or even alive. Yet the persistence of the Secret War's effects suggests that responsibility does not expire with time, and that historical accountability can and should be revisited even when formal mechanisms are absent. By examining Laos, scholars and observers are reminded that history is not merely a record of decisions, but a map of consequences, tracing how actions ripple outward across decades and generations. The Secret War's lessons are therefore not confined to Southeast Asia or the Cold War, but resonate wherever states possess the capacity to act without visibility and wherever strategic objectives are pursued at the expense of human cost. These lessons challenge the assumption that secrecy enhances effectiveness, revealing instead how it can obscure failure, prolong conflict, and deepen harm. They also challenge the notion that small nations are passive recipients of history, showing how local communities adapt, endure, and resist erasure even when their stories are marginalized. In Laos, this resistance takes the form of survival itself, of communities that continue to rebuild, remember, and negotiate a future shaped by forces beyond their control. The the secret war's enduring relevance lies in its capacity to illuminate the hidden dimensions of power, reminding us that wars do not need to be loud to be devastating, and that silence, far from being neutral, often serves as an accomplice to violence. As long as global conflicts continue to operate in the shadows, the experience of Laos stands as a cautionary example, urging vigilance not only toward what is visible, but toward what is deliberately kept out of sight, and challenging future generations to ask not only what wars are being fought, but which ones they are being asked not to see. As the secret war in Laos approaches its final reckoning in historical perspective, what ultimately distinguishes it from many other conflicts is not simply that it was hidden, but that its hidden nature shaped every stage of its existence, from its initiation to its conclusion and long aftermath, creating a form of warfare whose defining feature was not decisive victory or defeat, but endurance under obscurity. In Laos, the absence of public recognition meant that the war was never framed as a collective national crisis demanding resolution, but rather as a technical problem to be managed quietly, a posture that allowed it to persist beyond the point where its strategic rationale had eroded. This persistence reveals how secrecy can become self-sustaining, because once a conflict is insulated from public debate, the incentives to reassess diminish, and the mechanisms that sustain action continue operating even when objectives become unclear or unattainable. The war in Laos thus exemplifies how bureaucratic systems, when shielded from scrutiny, can normalize extraordinary levels of violence, converting bombing campaigns, displacement, and proxy warfare into routine administrative functions rather than moral choices. This normalization had profound consequences for those subjected to it, as civilians were forced to integrate danger into daily life without the psychological validation that comes from recognition, apology, or collective mourning. Over time, this produced a society in which resilience was essential but exhaustion was pervasive, and where peace, when it arrived, was experienced not as relief alone, but as a fragile reprieve layered over unresolved loss. The war's conclusion in 1975 did not usher in a moment of reckoning or healing comparable to those seen after more visible conflicts, because there was no shared acknowledgement of what had occurred, and without acknowledgement, there was no clear path to reconciliation. Instead, Laos entered a period of reconstruction defined by pragmatism and restraint, focused on stabilizing governance and rebuilding infrastructure while leaving deeper questions of memory and responsibility largely unaddressed. This choice reflected both necessity and constraint, as the new government faced economic isolation, regional dependence, and internal division, limiting its capacity to confront the past openly. For ordinary Laotians, the priority was survival and continuity, and in this context, silence often functioned as a protective strategy rather than a denial of experience. Yet silence has costs, because unspoken histories continue to shape behavior and expectation, influencing how societies understand authority, risk, and the limits of agency. In Laos, this influence can be seen in the enduring emphasis on caution, collective harmony, and avoidance of confrontation, values that facilitated endurance during wartime, but also constrained post-war political expression. These cultural adaptations are neither inherently negative nor wholly voluntary. They represent learned responses to prolonged vulnerability, responses that persist because the conditions that produced them were never fully resolved. In the diaspora, similar dynamics unfolded as refugees carried these adaptations into new contexts, where they sometimes clashed with cultural expectations of openness and self-advocacy, creating intergenerational tensions that reflected differing relationships to memory and safety. Younger generations, removed from the immediate dangers of war, often sought to articulate histories that their elders had learned to keep quiet, not as an act of rebellion, but as a means of understanding identity and place. This generational shift has been instrumental in bringing the Secret War into wider awareness, demonstrating how historical visibility often depends on temporal distance and changing social norms rather than on the intrinsic importance of events themselves. The gradual emergence of Laos's story into public discourse challenges the assumption that history naturally records what matters most, revealing instead how power, attention, and narrative framing determine which conflicts are remembered and which fade into obscurity. The Secret War illustrates that wars fought in the shadows can shape the modern world just as profoundly as those fought in the open, influencing migration patterns, political alignments, and humanitarian priorities in ways that are only recognized after the fact. Its legacy is visible not only in Laos, but in the broader architecture of global conflict, where covert action, proxy forces, and deniable operations have become increasingly common, often justified as means of minimizing risk, while in reality redistributing it onto less visible populations. Laos offers a cautionary example of how this redistribution operates, showing that when violence is outsourced or concealed, its costs do not vanish. They accumulate in places and among people with limited capacity to seek redress. The long struggle to clear unexploded ordnance stands as a material testament to this accumulation, transforming the landscape into a record of deferred responsibility that must be addressed long after the original decision-makers have departed. This deferred responsibility complicates ethical evaluation because it separates cause from effect across time and geography, making it easier to rationalize action in the moment while leaving future generations to confront its consequences. By tracing the Secret War's trajectory from covert initiation to enduring aftermath, one sees how secrecy functions not merely as a tactical choice, but as a structural condition that shapes outcomes, limits accountability, and prolongs harm. The war's history urges a re-evaluation of how conflicts are defined and judged, suggesting that declarations and visibility are less important than impact and duration in assessing significance. In this light, Laos emerges not as a peripheral theatre of the Cold War, but as a central example of how global power struggles can devastate smaller societies without ever fully entering public consciousness. The fact that the war could be fought so extensively without widespread awareness challenges assumptions about democratic oversight and the relationship between public knowledge and state action, raising enduring questions about how much violence can occur beyond the reach of collective consent. As contemporary conflicts increasingly rely on technologies and strategies that enable distance and deniability, the lessons of Laos become more rather than less relevant, reminding observers that invisibility does not equal restraint, and that the quietest wars may impose the heaviest burdens. The Secret War in Laos ultimately compels a broader understanding of war as a process rather than an event, one that unfolds across decades and generations, shaping lives long after the last bomb falls. Its story is not one of sudden revelation, but of gradual recognition, assembled piece by piece through memory, scholarship, and lived consequence. And in this slow assembly lies its enduring power. By paying attention to Laos, history expands to include not only what was proclaimed and recorded, but what was endured in silence, affirming that the measure of a war lies not in how loudly it is announced, but in how deeply it alters the human landscape it touches. Long after the last aircraft vanished beyond the horizon and the echoes of explosions faded into memory, the war in Laos continued to exist in quieter forms, lingering not as an event that could be pointed to on a calendar, but as a condition woven into the fabric of everyday life, shaping how people moved, spoke, planned, and remembered. This lingering presence reveals something essential about the nature of the Secret War, because unlike conflicts that end with treaties, parades, or widely acknowledged turning points, this war dissolved into silence without resolution, leaving behind a residue of adaptation rather than closure. In Laos, the absence of a clear endpoint meant that peace was experienced less as a transformation than as an easing of pressure, a gradual reduction in danger that never fully erased uncertainty. And this ambiguity shaped how individuals and communities interpreted their own survival. People did not ask whether the war had ended so much as whether it had paused long enough to allow life to continue, and this conditional understanding of peace influenced decisions about marriage, farming, migration, and education, embedding caution into aspirations themselves. Over time, this produced a society skilled at endurance, yet burdened by the invisible weight of unprocessed history, where resilience was celebrated because it was necessary, not because it was freely chosen. The Secret War's impact can be traced through these subtle recalibrations of expectation as generations learned to measure success not by expansion or ambition, but by continuity and safety. Values shaped by years, when survival depended on avoiding attention and minimizing risk. This orientation toward caution extended beyond personal life into broader social dynamics, reinforcing patterns of deference, communal harmony, and indirect communication that helped maintain stability, but also limited opportunities for open reckoning with the past. In this way, the war influenced not only what happened during the years of bombing, but how Laos imagined its future afterward, narrowing the range of possibilities considered realistic or desirable. For those who fled the country, these patterns travelled with them, carried into refugee camps and resettlement communities where safety was materially greater, but psychological habits persisted, shaping how families navigated unfamiliar systems and negotiated belonging in new societies. In these contexts, the Secret War often remained unnamed, its details withheld not because they lacked importance, but because explaining them required reliving experiences that had never been validated or acknowledged in the first place. Silence became a form of protection, a way to preserve dignity and emotional stability in environments where the war was unknown or misunderstood. Yet this silence also delayed the transmission of history, leaving younger generations to sense its presence without fully understanding its origins. As these younger generations came of age, their questions began to reopen the past, prompting elders to translate lived experience into narrative, often for the first time. And this translation revealed how deeply the war had shaped identity, worldview, and conceptions of power. Through these intergenerational exchanges, the Secret War gradually moved from instinct to story, from private memory to shared history, a shift that required time, distance, and changing cultural norms around disclosure and trauma. This slow emergence highlights how wars fought in secrecy impose a double burden, first through direct harm and later through delayed recognition, forcing survivors to carry both experience and explanation across decades. In Laos, this burden was compounded by the physical persistence of danger as unexploded ordnance continued to injure and kill long after the fighting stopped, reinforcing the sense that the war had not truly ended, but had simply changed form. Each accident served as a reminder that the past was not safely contained, that decisions made in distant offices still exerted force in present lives, and that the cost of secrecy was not abstract but tangible and ongoing. The labour of clearing these remnants, often undertaken by local teams supported by international organisations, became a form of quiet reconciliation, transforming landscapes of fear into spaces of possibility. Yet even this work underscored the asymmetry between destruction and repair, as years of bombing required generations of painstaking effort to undo. This asymmetry mirrors the broader imbalance inherent in covert warfare, where action is swift and consequences are slow, and where responsibility disperses across time until it appears to belong to no one in particular. The Secret War thus challenges conventional moral frameworks that rely on immediacy and visibility to assign accountability, revealing how harm can be inflicted efficiently while restitution remains fragmented and uncertain. For historians and policymakers, this challenge has prompted renewed attention to the structures that enable secrecy, including bureaucratic compartmentalization, euphemistic language, and the framing of violence as technical necessity rather than ethical choice. Laos provides a concrete example of how these structures operate, showing that secrecy is not merely a veil drawn over action, but a system that shapes decision-making itself, narrowing the range of questions asked and the voices heard. When wars are hidden, dissent is delayed, oversight is weakened, and the threshold for continuation lowers, allowing conflicts to persist beyond their strategic utility and moral justification. The gradual exposure of the secret war has illuminated these dynamics, but it has not eliminated them, as similar patterns continue to appear in contemporary conflicts where deniability and distance are prized. In this sense, Laos is not an isolated case, but an early manifestation of a broader shift in how power is exercised, one that privileges control over consent and efficiency over accountability. The war's legacy, therefore, extends beyond national borders, offering insights into the global evolution of warfare and the ethical dilemmas it presents. For Laos itself, the task has been to live with this legacy without being defined solely by it, balancing remembrance with the demands of development and the desire for a stable future. This balancing act is evident in the country's cautious engagement with the world, its emphasis on gradual change, and its selective approach to historical narrative, all of which reflect lessons learned from a period when visibility, invited intervention, and silence offered a measure of safety. Yet even as Laos moves forward, the secret war remains embedded in its landscapes, communities, and diasporas, a quiet presence that shapes perception and possibility. By examining this war, not as a hidden anomaly, but as a formative experience, one gains a deeper understanding of how conflicts can transform societies without ever being fully acknowledged, and how the absence of noise does not diminish impact. The story of Laos ultimately reminds us that history is not only written in proclamations and archives, but in habits, silences, and the slow work of adaptation, and that wars fought in the shadows leave marks that are no less real for having gone unseen. When the secret war in Laos is viewed not as a concealed episode of the Cold War, but as a long, unfolding human experience, its final meaning becomes inseparable from the idea that history often moves quietly, shaping lives without ever announcing itself, and that some of the most consequential forces operate not through spectacle, but through persistence. In Laos, the war's greatest impact was not limited to the years when bombs fell daily from the sky, but extended into the decades that followed, as communities learned to live within boundaries defined by fear, caution, and memory, adapting not because they chose to, but because survival required it. This adaptation reshaped how people understood authority, risk, and time itself, fostering a worldview in which stability was prized above transformation and continuity mattered more than ambition, values that made sense in a landscape where sudden change had once meant destruction. Over time, these values became embedded in social norms, influencing how decisions were made at every level, from household choices to national policy, reinforcing a preference for incremental change and avoidance of confrontation. This orientation toward caution has often been misunderstood by outside observers as passivity or acceptance, when, in reality, it reflects a deeply learned response to a period when visibility brought danger and silence offered protection. For those who endured the war, restraint was not a moral failing but a rational strategy, one that allowed families and communities to persist in an environment shaped by forces far beyond their control. In the diaspora, this same strategy manifested as adaptability, resilience, and a strong emphasis on mutual support. Qualities that enabled refugees to rebuild lives in unfamiliar settings, while carrying with them the unspoken imprint of a past that was rarely acknowledged by the societies around them. Children grew up sensing that something fundamental lay behind their parents' caution, even when its details were never fully explained, inheriting not stories but instincts, a heightened awareness of fragility and a respect for stability that contrasted sharply with the confidence of their peers. As these children matured, many sought to bridge the gap between instinct and understanding, prompting a gradual articulation of the Secret War's history through education, scholarship, and cultural expression, and in doing so, they transformed private memory into public narrative. This transformation did not erase pain, but it altered its meaning, shifting it from a source of isolation into a foundation for connection and recognition, and it demonstrated that even the most suppressed histories can resurface when conditions allow. Yet this resurgence also highlighted how long invisibility can persist when conflicts lack the symbols, slogans, and official acknowledgement that anchor collective memory, revealing a bias in historical attention toward wars that are loud, dramatic, and politically convenient. Laos challenges this bias by showing that a war can be vast in scale and devastating in impact without ever becoming central to public consciousness, and that such invisibility has consequences not only for those who suffer, but for how societies learn from the past. The Secret War exposes the danger of equating visibility with importance, reminding us that strategic marginality does not correlate with human cost, and that some of the most severe forms of harm occur precisely where scrutiny is weakest. This lesson resonates in contemporary contexts where conflict increasingly unfolds through remote technologies, classified programs, and proxy forces, enabling violence to be exercised at a distance while minimizing immediate political accountability. Laos serves as an early warning of how such approaches can entrench cycles of harm, as decisions made under secrecy generate legacies that outlast the strategic moment and demand attention long after the original justifications have faded. The persistence of unexploded ordnance stands as a stark symbol of this dynamic, transforming fields, forests, and villages into repositories of deferred responsibility, where the past asserts itself through ongoing danger rather than historical debate. Each clearance operation represents not only a technical achievement, but a moral act, acknowledging that the war's consequences remain present and that responsibility does not expire with time. Yet the scale of this task also underscores the imbalance between destruction and repair, highlighting how easily harm can be inflicted and how slowly it can be undone, particularly when those affected lack the power to demand redress. This imbalance complicates narratives of progress and closure, suggesting that the end of violence does not equate to the restoration of possibility, and that recovery is often constrained by legacies that resist neat resolution. For Laos, moving forward has meant navigating this tension between remembering and rebuilding, between acknowledging the past and avoiding the destabilization that open reckoning might bring, a balancing act shaped by both internal priorities and external pressures. The state's cautious approach to historical narrative reflects an understanding that memory can be both empowering and destabilizing, particularly in societies where the scars of war are unevenly distributed and politically sensitive. At the same time, the persistence of memory among individuals and communities ensures that the Secret War is not fully contained by official silence, continuing to surface through lived experience, diaspora advocacy, and scholarly inquiry. This interplay between silence and expression reveals that history is not a fixed account, but a dynamic process, negotiated over time as conditions change and new voices emerge. The Secret War's gradual movement from obscurity to recognition demonstrates that while power can delay acknowledgement, it cannot permanently suppress the effects of violence, which continue to shape lives regardless of whether they are named. In this sense, Laos offers a profound lesson about the limits of control, showing that even wars designed to leave minimal traces can imprint themselves deeply on societies, altering trajectories in ways that resist erasure. As observers reflect on this history, the temptation may be to treat it as a cautionary tale belonging to a bygone era, yet the structures that enabled the secret war remain present, adapted to new technologies and geopolitical realities. The capacity to act covertly, to diffuse responsibility, and to minimize public scrutiny continues to shape how conflicts are initiated and sustained, making the lessons of Laos as relevant today as they were decades ago. By examining this war not as an anomaly but as a manifestation of enduring patterns, one gains insight into how power operates when shielded from visibility and how its consequences are borne by those least able to influence its exercise. The story of the secret war in Laos ultimately challenges us to rethink how we define war, peace, and accountability, urging a shift away from narrow criteria based on declarations and toward a broader understanding that recognizes harm wherever it occurs, whether acknowledged or not. It reminds us that silence does not neutralize violence, that invisibility does not mitigate impact, and that the quietest conflicts may demand the most careful attention precisely because they are easiest to overlook. In honoring the experiences of those who lived through the secret war, history expands beyond official narratives to include the textures of everyday survival, affirming that what is endured in silence is no less real, and that the measure of a war lies not in how loudly it is announced, but in how deeply it reshapes the human lives caught within it. At the end of this long and quiet history, the secret war in Laos leaves behind no single image that can contain it, no definitive moment that neatly closes the story, because its true conclusion is not an event but an understanding, one that emerges only when all the fragments are held together long enough to reveal their shape. What happened in Laos was not an accident of geography or an inevitable byproduct of the Cold War, but the result of deliberate choices made within systems that valued deniability, efficiency, and strategic abstraction over visibility, consent, and human cost. And once those systems were set in motion, they proved remarkably resistant to restraint. The war expanded not through dramatic declarations, but through routine decisions, approvals signed quietly, missions logged under neutral language, and policies justified by distance, and this routine nature is what allowed extraordinary levels of destruction to occur without triggering the alarms that visible wars often set off. For the people of Laos, the consequences of these decisions were immediate and enduring, reshaping land, family, culture, and possibility in ways that did not end when the bombing stopped, but continued through displacement, silence, and the long work of adaptation. Villages rebuilt themselves on scarred ground, families carried memory through instinct rather than ceremony, and generations learned caution not as a philosophy but as a survival skill, absorbing the war into daily life without ever being told that it was supposed to be there. This absorption is perhaps the most unsettling legacy of the secret war, because it shows how violence can become normalized when it is not named, how suffering can be internalized when it is not recognized, and how entire societies can be shaped by forces that never publicly acknowledge their presence. In the diaspora, the war followed different paths, crossing oceans and borders, resurfacing in moments of confusion, curiosity, and identity formation, as children and grandchildren asked questions that had once been too dangerous or too painful to answer, slowly transforming silence into story and isolation into connection. Through these acts of remembering, the secret war began to re-enter history, not as a sensational revelation, but as a sober correction, filling in a space that had been left deliberately blank. This re-entry matters, not because it changes what happened, but because it changes how we understand responsibility, reminding us that wars do not need to be declared to be real, and that the absence of public debate does not absolve societies of moral consequence. Laos demonstrates that when war is hidden, its costs are not reduced, they are redistributed, falling most heavily on those with the least power to resist or recover, while accountability disperses across institutions and decades until it appears to belong to no one at all. The unexploded ordnance scattered across the countryside stands as a physical expression of this dispersion, a reminder that the past is not finished simply because it is inconvenient to confront, and that repair, unlike destruction, cannot be accelerated by secrecy or force. Each bomb removed from the soil is an acknowledgement delayed, a recognition that the war's end was administrative rather than ethical, and that closure requires more than silence. In reflecting on the secret war, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in what it reveals about Laos, but in what it reveals about modern warfare itself, about how power adapts to constraints by becoming quieter, about how language can soften perception while hardening outcomes, and about how distance, whether geographical or bureaucratic, can erode empathy without eliminating consequence. The structures that enabled the war in Laos have not disappeared. They have evolved, finding new forms in remote operations, proxy conflicts, and classified programs that promise control without visibility. And it is here that the story's relevance becomes most urgent. Laos is not simply a historical case to be remembered. It is a warning encoded in lived experience, showing that when conflicts are fought beyond public view, they do not become smaller or cleaner. They become harder to stop, harder to mourn, and harder to repair. The war's quiet persistence across generations challenges the assumption that history naturally corrects itself, demonstrating instead that recognition requires effort, attention, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths long after strategic priorities have shifted. To remember, the secret war is not to dwell on the past, but to sharpen awareness of the present, to recognize that the most consequential violence is often the least visible, and that the absence of noise should never be mistaken for the absence of harm. In the end, the story of Laos asks a simple but unsettling question, not how such a war was hidden, but how many others have been or will be, and what it means to live in a world where entire societies can be transformed without ever becoming a headline. By listening to this quiet history, by holding space for what was endured rather than announced, the measure of war shifts away from spectacle and toward impact, away from declarations and toward lives. And in that shift lies the possibility of learning something lasting. The secret war in Laos does not conclude with triumph or closure, but with a lingering obligation, an insistence that what is done in silence still matters, that what is hidden still shapes the world, and that history's quiet chapters deserve to be heard precisely because they speak in the absence of sound.